Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be the first of 3 parts in my series on complex numbers. Let's get started. A complex number has the form a plus bi, where a and b are some real numbers called the real part and imaginary part, respectively, and I, which we also call the imaginary unit, is the square root of -1. Now, perhaps in your previous math classes, you were told that you can't take the square root of negative numbers. That was a bit of a white lie, in that you can take the square root of negative numbers, but it's a little complicated, and we're going to talk about it now. Again, complex numbers have the form a plus bi, where I've got a real number plus a real number times I. And two complex numbers are equal if their real and imaginary parts are the same. So that is, if a plus bi is equal to c plus di, if a and c are the same, and b and d are the same. To add or subtract these complex numbers, we just add or subtract their real and imaginary parts separately, almost treating I like a variable. So let's compute each of the following, and we're going to do the first one together. Again, with that mentality of treating I like a variable, I want to combine my like terms. I've got a 7 and a -9, which together make -2. And then I've got 3i plus another 2i, which together make 5i. So -2 plus 5i would be the sum. Go ahead and pause the video here to see if you can do the next one on your own. The correct answer is -6i. Notice I have a minus sign this time. So if it helps to distribute that minus sign and write it as addition, you can. That's what I did in my first step. Or you can just subtract the like terms. 3 minus 3 is 0, so I have no real part anymore. And -4 minus 2 is -6i. We've talked about addition and subtraction. Let's move on to multiplication next. Again, multiplication here is almost no different than multiplication with real numbers. We just treat them like binomials. Again, almost thinking about I as a variable. So when I multiply these two complex numbers together, I need to FOIL them out. The first terms give me 3 times 5 is 15. 3 times -4i is -12i. 2i times 5 is 10i. And -4i times 2i is -8i squared. Now we need to combine some like terms. My -12i and +10i simplify down to -2i minus 8i squared. Now there's something we can actually do to simplify further. Remember, I is the square root of -1. So I squared is the square root of -1 squared. These two cancel out, and I'm left with just -1. So I can simplify further to 15 minus 2i minus 8 times -1, or plus 8. And now I have two more like terms to combine, giving me 23 minus 2i as the final answer. I've got one more for you to try. Go ahead and pause the video here to see if you can do this one on your own. This one's pretty straightforward. Here I've just got a real number times a complex number, so I just distribute it to both the real and imaginary parts, and I'm left with -42 plus 21i. One more for you to try. Go ahead and give this one a shot now. Similarly, I have an imaginary number. By the way, an imaginary number is just the name we give to a complex number without a real part. So I've got an imaginary number times a complex number. I just distribute it to both the real and imaginary parts. And notice when I distribute it to the negative I get a minus 2i squared. That's going to turn that into a real number, since we learned earlier that I squared is negative 1. I hope from this video that you take away how to add, subtract, and multiply complex numbers. You may be wondering about division, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than the other three. So we're going to reserve that for a video of its own. Catch y'all in the next one.